Thank you, everyone. Now I will introduce our speakers. So we have Mahima, an activist and a member of the Toronto branch of Spring, and James, a member of Spring, also based in Toronto, who was active during the anti-Iraq war movement. So before I hand it over to our speakers, I'll just explain how the meeting will work. The speakers will go for a total of 30 minutes. Then we will have questions and comments from the audience. The speakers will respond to your questions and comments at the end in their concluding remarks. So if you'd like to speak, please raise your hand and I will add you to the speakers list. I will be using Spring's equity speakers list, which means I may not call on you in the sequence in which you raised your hands, but will prioritize Indigenous, Black, comrades of color, women, and first-time speakers. Questions and/or comments are welcome, but please try to keep your contributions to 3 minutes, and this will allow for more contributions during the discussion. Finally, we encourage you to post on social media throughout the conference to share your thoughts and experiences. You can use the hashtag RedOctober2025, and you can tag Spring on all platforms using @SpringMag.ca. Okay, now we can go over to the speakers.
Okay, so I'd like to just start by discussing why we decided to choose this topic in the first place. In 2003, we saw the creation of a global mass movement in opposition to the invasion of Iraq, which mobilized tens of millions of people in every continent for a global day of action. At the time, this was considered the largest protest in the history of the world. The strength of the anti-war movement led to Canada, as well as some other longtime US allies, ultimately not joining the invasion of Iraq. So we want to examine some of the main strategies of the anti-war movement at the time, with the goal of learning from the past and applying these lessons to our current situation. So let's briefly talk about the lead up to the war. Of course, one of the main motives for the US to invade Iraq was access to oil. Iraq has some of the largest oil reserves in the world, and its oil industry at the time was nationalized. In fact, in May 2001, the National Energy Report outlined an interest in increasing these sources of oil to the US and urged the government to persuade resistant countries to open up their industries to US companies. And also notably, many cabinet members had strong personal connections to US oil companies. Beyond simply possessing oil, controlling Iraq could increase US leverage over other oil-dependent countries and prevent some of the US's rivals, like Russia and China, from having any access at all. It would also open the door to further US dominance in the Middle East, where the establishment of compliant neoliberal regimes could reaffirm US global hegemony. Now, the US government found an opportunity to garner popular support for its military plans by exploiting the events of 9/11. Planting the seeds for the Iraq War, government officials at the time were attempting to connect Saddam Hussein to the attacks by Al Qaeda. 9/11 was portrayed as an act of war on American values by these Islamic terrorists who hate democracy and freedom. And this framing allowed George W. Bush to swiftly announce a war on terror and begin the invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001. With the overall climate of fear, patriotism, and increasing Islamophobia, many people actually supported this invasion, and Bush's approval rating soared above 90%. Now, the official case for war against Iraq came in 2002, with the US government claiming that Saddam Hussein was developing weapons of mass destruction. The claim didn't really have that much basis in reality. For the most part, Iraq had destroyed its nuclear program in 1991 after the last US invasion. UN weapon inspectors in Iraq found no evidence of plans to create nuclear weapons, and this information was communicated to the US prior to the invasion. The US government continuously claimed to have evidence and spread false testimonies from CIA assets. And the mainstream media at the time was simply repeating all these claims, which created a sort of feedback loop where the government could then cite these respected newspapers as their evidence. However, without evidence, the UN did not seem likely to give their approval for this war, and this was bolstered by the strong global anti-war movement, which had many historic US allies hesitating to provide support. Without support from the UN, the US nevertheless launched its invasion in March 2003. So now let's take a step back and talk about what the anti-war movement looked like at this time. With the end of the Gulf War in 1991, the anti-war movement had this period of dormancy. However, the late 90s saw the growth of the anti-globalization movement, which was critical of neoliberal economics and the increasing political power of multinational corporations. There were mass demonstrations, including 80,000 people protesting the April 2001 Summit of the Americas, which happened in Quebec City. Unfortunately, a lot of this momentum was lost with 9/11 and the ensuing climate of fear and repression. There was a decrease in large-scale activities and, crucially, a relatively small response to the invasion of Afghanistan, which occurred only a month after the attacks. Canada ended up joining and playing a large role in that invasion. In June 2002, Canada hosted the high security G8 summit, which again brought out thousands of anti globalization activists. With the US starting to lay the framework for an invasion of Iraq, a case was made to pivot to anti war organizing. Starting with modest actions, the movement started to pick up momentum as Bush started appealing to the UN and activists started engaging their communities and unions. The first Pan Canadian Days of Action took place on the weekend of November 19th and 20th, 2002, with coordinated actions across a dozen cities. The movement continued to grow, with tens of thousands of people marching in January 2003. Similar movements were happening across the world, with an International Day of Action planned for February 15th, 2003. On this day, millions of people on every continent, including research scientists based in Antarctica, held demonstrations to stop the war, many of them protesting for the first time. Over 80 cities in Canada had demonstrations, with around 80,000 to 100,000 people attending in Toronto and over 250,000 in Montreal. This was something no one could ignore, least of all the federal Liberals who were still considering joining the US. A month later, on March 15th, another historic march occurred, which again brought 250,000 people to the streets of Montreal. 2 days later, Prime Minister Chrétien announced that Canada would not be joining the Iraq War. 3 days after that, the US began its invasion of Iraq without the support of countries like Canada, France, or Germany, who had just 2 years ago joined the invasion of Afghanistan. So now I'll pass it to James to talk about the movement's organizing principles.
Thanks, Mahima. A big part of the strategies and tactics that shaped our activity over 20 years ago are the foundational organizing principles that helped inform our overall strategy. So these principles are conclusions that many of us in the wider movements had drawn after many years of organizing and of trying to develop what we'd call best practices. I'm going to cover 5 of them here. The first one is that if we're organizing in the Canadian state, we need to hold our own government to account for the things it does, especially its foreign policy. In this case, we didn't want Canada to join the US-led war on Iraq, and we wanted the federal government to stop campaigning for a second resolution at the United Nations, which was Canada's effort to build multilateral support for the bombing and invasion of Iraq. Holding our own government to account meant that we had to do that work at home. The most likely way that we could weaken, slow, or stop the US drive to war was not by trying to stop the US directly, that's the job of movements inside the US, but by stopping our own state, where we ostensibly have some influence, from giving it military, political, or moral support. This would have implications for the kinds of slogans we raised at the time and where they were directed. The second organizing principle is the idea that people's ideas change in struggle. What that means is that people learn things by doing, testing things out, being part of a campaign, meeting other people as they do this work, coming up against new and different ideas, seeing how things happen, and making mistakes and learning from them. The dominant ideas under capitalism always discourage us from doing anything about the injustices we see in the world. They claim that it's always been this way, that there's no alternative, and that the best you can do is look out for yourself and your family. But when people are moved to do things to try to change the world around them, they become much more open to radical ideas, politics, and practice. And so knowing this puts a premium on making it easy for people to get involved in things. You want as many people as possible to have the opportunity to see and discover that things don't have to be this way and that there's something they can do about it. Getting involved in activity, whether it's helping organize a meeting, putting up posters, attending a demonstration, whatever it is, these are all opportunities to build our collective confidence. The third organizing principle is that numbers matter. This might seem obvious, but what that means is that a demonstration of 100,000 people is going to have a much bigger impact on the government, the people who make decisions about the world we live in, including our foreign policy, than a much smaller gathering of a few dozen or even a few hundred people. The bigger a demonstration or an event, the more it creates pressure on decision makers, especially those who don't really care about anything other than being reelected. If they perceive that they're losing support, they can be pushed to do what we want them to do. Another point to mention about numbers is that bigger events build the confidence of all those who participate. They feel stronger and more effective. They have a greater sense of the possibility of collective action and solidarity, and they are visible to even greater numbers of people who might see them on the news or on the street and who sympathize with their demands, but who lack the confidence to join them. The fourth organizing principle is that it matters who you attract to attend your events. It makes a very big difference to have large numbers of workers, especially if they participate as part of an organized contingent of trade unionists or as members of their unions. There are two reasons for this. The first reason is that unions have the capacity, when they turn their mind to it, to mobilize massive numbers of people, which both brings a lot of people to your event and builds the confidence of those workers to participate. If they see their union leaders doing it, they may feel more comfortable joining a demonstration knowing that the leadership has their back and that their fellow union members all support the same demands. In this sense, unions have what we call social weight. They are truly mass organizations that represent thousands to hundreds of thousands of workers. The second reason for this is that workers have a strategic relationship to the economy and to the means of production. As socialists, we know that workers produce all the wealth of the world, and they are the source of all profit, what drives the capitalist system. When workers stop working, for whatever reason and for however long, they temporarily stop the production of profit. And in those moments, it gives us a glimpse of their potential collective power as a class. Involving workers in mass mobilizations can have the effect of building their confidence to pursue militant actions in their own workplaces, which is a step in the direction towards workers taking on the system as a whole. The fifth organizing principle is about internationalism. In some ways, this is related to the first organizing principle about holding our own government to account. The flip side is a recognition about a crucial international division of labor in our movements. Only the people of Iraq, in this instance, can or should decide who governs them, how they organize themselves, and what they do to resist. There was a movement inside Iraq that chose its own strategies and tactics. What they do there is not the same as what we do here. The anti-war movement is part of an international solidarity movement, but it's not the Iraqi resistance. We need to choose strategies and tactics that make sense for our own situation. And if we build an effective movement that stops our own government from interfering with Iraqis' right to self-determination, then we show the greatest possible act of solidarity to Iraqis who don't have to contend with Canadian bombs, fighter jets, troops, etc., and can instead focus on building their own movements inside Iraq. I'll now pass it off to Mahima, who's going to talk about strategy and tactics.
Thanks, James. So let's take a moment to define what we mean by strategies and tactics. Strategies are the overarching goals that guide the movement over a period of time. What is it that the whole movement wants to achieve? What objectives should be reached to be considered a success? Tactics are then the specific actions taken at any given moment in order to fulfill the goals of the strategy. By basing each tactic on the guiding strategic principles, each action is able to be more effective. Now, with the organizing principles that James just covered in mind, two main strategies came to light. The first strategy was a focus on the Canadian state. Most of the organizing was centered specifically around stopping Canada from going to war, as well as combating the rise of Islamophobia and racism by the state, such as specific campaigns targeting the Canadian policies, which resulted in the unlawful detention and deportation of Muslims. Focusing on Canadian complicity was necessary, as no one else could be expected to hold our government to account. Our movements have to take responsibility for challenging our own state. And without acknowledging the complicity of Canada in the dehumanization of Arabs and Muslims, which had the effect of discouraging many of them from paying attention to the horrific reality of a war, we risk perpetuating that racist dynamic. Also, while the ideal scenario would have been for the US to not go to war at all, Keeping Canada away would weaken the war effort, and this goal was more achievable for activists in Canada than demanding our government change the mind of the US. Ultimately, we hold the most power within our communities. So while the solidarity was international, the demands focused on the actions of Canada. The second strategy was building a mass movement. To convince the government to take action, it was important to show that invading Iraq was a wildly unpopular opinion. Creating a mass movement meant the demands were at the forefront of public conversation and couldn't be ignored easily. For an urgent and time sensitive issue, it was important to force a response through numbers. Also, mass movements snowball, with people feeling more confident in engaging in actions if they already see many others doing it, especially if groups they've already been involved in are showing their support. A mass movement would also enable activists to connect the Iraq War to other issues, such as Canada's role in Afghanistan and the occupation of Palestine, introducing these links to many people new to organizing. Some of the tactics used to achieve this included pan-Canadian and global days of action and the involvement of large labor, student, and religious groups. Speaking of, I'll now hand it to James to dive into some of the main tactics the movement focused on.
Now that Mahima has sketched out the two main strategies that united a section of our movement, I'll turn my attention to some of the tactics that we pursued and why we pursued them. The first big question is, what kind of actions would we organize? And how would we go about doing that? One immediate question we confronted felt like a contradiction. We wanted to build a mass movement, but it's very hard to build big events. Before you're big, you have to be small. But the way you build small events when you're first starting off is really important. It creates the conditions over time for your events to attract more and more people and to grow rapidly into much bigger actions. In other words, you need to choose tactics that support that overall strategy of growing bigger and bigger actions. Perhaps the most obvious mass action that comes to mind is a mass demonstration, something like a rally and march that attracts tens and thousands of people. But building mass demonstrations takes a lot of time and requires a smart strategy that makes it easy for people to participate. People need to be convinced of the issue, but they also need to feel confident enough to do something about it and trust the people organizing or hosting the action in order to join it. As Mahima described in their introduction, the first attempts at pulling together a network of activists across Canada to do anti-sanctions and anti-war organizing happened during all the counter-organizing and protests in response to the G8 summit in Calgary and Kananaskis in June 2002. About 75 people attended a meeting and agreed to do some modest organizing in July and August. Our plan was to organize easy, accessible, but visible actions that anybody could join. You didn't have to have a lot of experience, and it was low risk. No one was facing the threat of arrest. The actions we chose to do were information pickets outside Liberal MPs' offices in the week surrounding Hiroshima Day in August, and to circulate a petition that called for no sanctions and no war on Iraq. The petition functioned mainly as a tool to attract passers-by and engage them in conversation, to find out who agreed with us and learn how to make effective arguments. It was also an effective tool to see which activists wanted to pursue, quote, a mass politics strategy, i.e., talk to ordinary working class people and not just to other activists who already agree with us. As we organized for Hiroshima Day, we discovered more and more people who wanted to do this work. And we soon felt the need to start building local and then citywide coalitions where organizations, including unions, faith groups, students, community groups, Arab and Muslim organizations, and so on, could join. We were beginning to attract people who were worried about the coming war, but not sure what to do about it. We made it easy to join and do things. In the process, we built our own confidence to do more things. We gained all kinds of skills and insights that we otherwise wouldn't have acquired if we hadn't been trying these things. And crucially, we were building trust in each other and the organizations coming around us. They knew that we hosted politically accessible events that reflected their concerns and demands, and that it was easy for them to join, whether as organizers or as attendees. As we moved into the fall of 2002, we started hosting events that other organizations were now interested in helping to build and support. This was long before everyone had access to the internet as an organizing tool. And so we promoted events mainly by putting up thousands and even tens of thousands of posters all over the city and by giving out as many leaflets. We organized these on what were called poster runs and leafleting sessions. This might seem like more work than sharing posts on social media, but our actions were much more visible to the wider public. You would see our posters everywhere for weeks on end, and you would encounter lots of people giving out leaflets at subway stations, at community events, in faith groups, at union meetings, in classrooms, in lecture halls, and so on. Over time, the cumulative effect of so many people doing the same thing in so many different parts of the city meant that we were sinking roots everywhere and drawing in lots of new people who wanted to do something about the coming war. As Mahima described, the first big breakthroughs came in early November 2002, when the demonstrations were suddenly in the thousands and not just dozens or hundreds. By early January, we were in the tens of thousands. And in order to build momentum between events, we knew we couldn't have an action every single weekend or even every other weekend. We knew that we needed 4, 6, or sometimes even 8 weeks to build towards a mass action in order to create a big buzz about it and to mobilize all the people we needed to be there. In between the big mass actions, we focused on local actions to keep up our visibility, to sink local roots, and to build towards a common action. We held neighborhood-based panel discussions and community meetings, teach-ins on campus and in high schools, lunchroom meetings and workplaces, and sometimes citywide speaking events with high-profile speakers. All these smaller actions gave us an accessible and sustainable focus of activity and the possibility of doing different things while allowing us to build towards something much bigger that we would be part of together. The mass actions allowed us to build a united movement which respected whatever political difference might exist among us, but that gave us an opportunity to unite behind common shared demands. I'll now pass it back to Mahima, who's going to talk about mass organizations and how we built them.
So, the second tactic was the involvement of mass organizations, namely unions and labor movements. We just discussed the importance of mass movements, and when we consider unions with thousands of members, the act of engaging these mass organizations to take anti war stances can be considered a mass action itself. Unions can have huge impacts on societal opinion, both due to their size, but also due to the wide range of people they represent, many of whom wouldn't otherwise find themselves on the front lines of social movements. Now, Labor had previously failed to mobilize massively in response to the invasion of Afghanistan, and it was important to learn why that was so as to avoid those same pitfalls. As we discussed, the post 9/11 climate was one filled with fear and uncertainty, with increased surveillance and critiques of the US being conflated with support for terrorism. In this climate, many union leaders were hesitant to publicly support anti war stances, and there weren't many avenues available to organize as labor outside of these unions. It was necessary to create coalitions that brought together rank and file activists across sectors so that they could share resources and develop strategies on how to build support for the anti war movement within their unions and also place pressure on their leadership from below. One of the first such coalitions was Trade Unionists Against the War, which was based in Toronto. As mentioned before, ideas change and struggle, and people build confidence by simply getting involved in movements and seeing the work they're capable of doing. These organizations were exceptionally important in engaging trade unionists outside of their unions, which allowed a large number of workers to become better organizers. That being said, gaining official union support is certainly an important thing, especially when one of the barriers to a mass movement is the fear of retaliation. If your union takes an official stance and you know you won't get fired for opposing the war, you'll likely feel much more confident about becoming active in the movement. Union leaders were often invited to speak at demonstrations, which allowed them to understand the depth of support that the movement had, and their presence encouraged activists on the ground to continue their work. We were aiming to build both the confidence of rank and file union members and the leaders. Having trade unionists as part of the anti war movement also really helped the movement develop. Aside from tapping into their large networks, they were also able to provide advice for organizing and could sometimes secure monetary support from their unions or other resources like meeting spaces. We also know that organized labor is important because workers hold the power to directly impact the war machine. Without labor, weapons couldn't be built and transported. For sectors not directly involved in war logistics, the threat to the economy of a general strike is massive. Of course, it's no simple task to simply walk out on your job, not without first doing the work of building those mass organizations. While we did not end up seeing many workplace strikes at the time, the very presence of a large number of organized workers at demonstrations always carried an undercurrent of that threat to the ruling class, which increased the impact of the movement on government decision making. While labor holds a unique role in the movement, other mass organizations were also present. Students hold a similar role to the labor movement, where mass walkouts pose a disruption to the status quo. Especially in Toronto, students made up a large portion of the movement, with organizations like Students Against Sanctions and War on Iraq organizing marches and mobilized thousands of students. There was also the large presence of faith-based organizations, with the movement dedicated to calling out Canadian complicity in Islamophobia and centering itself around principles of anti-oppression. Many Muslims felt confident in bringing their communities into the movement. There was also the Canadian Council of Churches writing to the Prime Minister in opposition to the war, with large Christian contingents at the Montreal protests in particular. With labor at the forefront, mass organizations were crucial in building a mass movement. And now I'll hand it to James to talk about slogans.
Thanks, Mahima. The next section flows from Mahima's discussion and has to do with how we came up with the slogans and demands that we used for the mass actions and for the basis of unity that brought everyone together. The first thing we had to recognize is who our audience was. Who were we trying to attract to join us? And what kind of barriers existed that might prevent them from agreeing with us or from feeling confident that they could participate? As Mahima described, we had to choose a simple basis of unity if we were going to attract mass organizations whose members might have many diverse views on the issue of the war and other organizations that might also have differing views about the world and how it works. When we formed the Toronto Coalition to Stop the War in November 2002, its basis of unity covered three simple demands. Number one, oppose the war on terror. Number two, oppose racism, Islamophobia, and anti-Arab bigotry. And number three, defend civil liberties and the right to protest. This might sound like an obvious approach, but it took more than a year to be able to bring together a citywide coalition on this particular basis because there was initially a lot of disagreement about the demands. Many of the people who were involved in the early days of organizing were activists, to no surprise. Some were on the far left and identified as revolutionaries of some kind or another. Many were consciously opposed to imperialism and wanted an explicit basis of unity that called for the defeat of the US, Canada, and all forms of imperialism. Other activists wanted us to list all other active wars that were underway and not just focus on Iraq. Others were opposed to the inclusion of faith groups and wanted the coalition to explicitly endorse secularism in Iraq and as a principle of the left. And others wanted us to call for the overthrow of Saddam Hussein and to clearly express opposition to the Iraqi government as part of the basis of unity. These early debates, which were very intense at the time, made it impossible to attract anyone except people on the far left or very small socialist organizations. Even though many of us agreed in principle with the demands, the tactic didn't support the broader goal of mass organizing, mass organizations, or mass actions. We knew we needed a basis of unity that would allow mass organizations and ordinary people in mass numbers to come together and to do things together. It didn't mean that we all had to agree with each other on every single thing, just those three demands. We could retain the viewpoints we had about the world, about capitalism, imperialism, etc. But we agreed not to make agreement with all those things a precondition to join or participate in the coalition. In fact, as socialists, some of us knew that we needed to build a mass audience for socialist ideas and politics first and not insist that people already agree with us ahead of time. We knew that because ideas change and struggle, people would be open to these ideas and politics once they came into contact with them. And the most effective socialist organizations did two things. First, they built the coalition as big as possible and actively removed barriers to people's participation. And second, when those people showed up, They found ways to engage them, to invite them to socialist meetings and conferences, to distribute leaflets and newspapers and magazines and so on. This is what it means to meet people where they're at. This approach is based on an analysis about why people have contradictory ideas, how ideas change, and how people can radicalize against the system. One way of describing how this process would happen is this: come to stop the war, stay to end imperialism. This affected the kinds of demands we would raise on demonstrations and how we popularized them. For the Iraq War protests, our demand was simply don't attack Iraq. That was it. And as we continued organizing, and as the Canadian government tried to get the United Nations on side for the war, we altered it slightly to this: with or without the UN, don't attack Iraq. We had to add that extra part because we wanted to insulate the movement from a situation where the United Nations might have endorsed the war. We wanted to pressure the Canadian government to stay out of the war, even if the United Nations sanctioned it. US bombs with the UN stamp of approval are still bombs after all. And we wanted to make sure that a split wouldn't emerge in our movement if the United Nations got on board. The beauty of this approach, a simple basis of unity and broad and accessible slogans, meant that we were able to build mass citywide coalitions in every major city and town across Canada, which were the organizing vehicles for the mass actions that took place, and then to unite them into a mass central pan-Canadian network, the Canadian Peace Alliance, which helped coordinate mass days of actions and protest for nearly a decade after the high point of the anti-war movement around the Iraq War, and to replicate the most effective methods to try to bring Canadian troops home from Afghanistan, and to oppose other fronts of the war on terror. It's been over 20 years since the Iraq War protests, and even longer since we started organizing to oppose the coming war. But there are many rich lessons from that period that we could consider applying to today's movements. The key was to have a clear sense of strategy, opposing our own state and building a mass movement, and then deciding which tactics made the most sense at any given moment to ensure that our actions supported the overall strategy, which was our roadmap to achieve our goal of stopping Canada's participation in the war. To our surprise, even though we knew we were achieving success in terms of building bigger and more effective actions, we did actually stop the Canadian government from joining the war, despite their concerted efforts to do so. One way we determined whether to pursue a tactic was to ask ourselves, will this build the confidence of ordinary people to support our demands and join us? If it didn't, we usually didn't pursue the tactic. And this was our guide for everything from slogans and demands to the kind of posters and leaflets and other materials we designed, to the kind of language we used at events, to the speakers we invited to speak. In many cases, people who were leaders, people who had profile and influence, and who would benefit from being in front of a large crowd of people echoing our demands, and not often activists or the far left. It even shaped decisions like flooding our events with hundreds of thousands of placards to ensure that the media wouldn't get our message wrong, and to reach the many more people who would be watching us and thinking, maybe I could join them. One really key lesson to learn in this discussion is that when millions of people enter into action or activity like they did during the movement against the Iraq War, a great many of them will be changed politically for the rest of their lives. Some will become socialists and anti-imperialists and go on to support other struggles. An entire generation of people were affected by that movement, even if, in the end, we didn't stop the devastation of the US bombing campaign, invasion, and occupation of Iraq. But the success of movements and struggles must be measured beyond just the immediate goals. We need to think about how every attempt at mass action lays the ground for other bigger struggles yet to come, including the biggest fight of all, to end the systems of capitalism and imperialism. We won't get to that big fight unless we make it easy for people to join, and unless we show the radical optimism that when people have the chance to do things together, they almost always come out the other side stronger, more confident, and ready for the next fight.
Since the Iraq War, we've had numerous movements opposing military actions around the world. Within just the past few years, we've seen mass mobilizations opposing the genocide in Palestine. Let's take a moment to discuss how some of the lessons from Iraq War anti-war organizing could apply to this movement. So, we saw the attacks on October 7th get a similar treatment to 9/11 in terms of invoking the events as a justification for any sort of military action. One difference we saw is that pro Palestine groups mobilized immediately, sharing the history of the occupation on social media and holding demonstrations across the world. Not surprisingly, many of these demonstrations faced right wing attacks and were accused of being pro terrorist marches, anti Semitic, and insensitive. In light of how difficult it was to reverse military action in Afghanistan and remove the troops after they entered, and even how much popular support it had due to strong initial propaganda, I do think it was important for the current movement to solidify its anti war presence early. We've also seen global mass actions in support of Palestine starting from 2023. Some of the actions were record breaking, with many new people joining the movement. But for a lot of regular workers, it was difficult to keep up momentum week after week, with many discouraged by the ongoing genocide. But support never completely waned, and some of the largest protests for Palestine just happened in the last few months. One area where we could have potentially strengthened our movement was by having more coordinated days of action. That phrase was sometimes invoked on social media, but it was kind of more symbolic, with activists already aware that the world was continuously marching together. But recently, in a very short time period, we saw huge global mobilizations in response to both 2 years of genocide and the treatment of the flotillas. While the Gaza peace plan is not something to be praised, it did offer some relief to Palestinians, and Trump has stated that he convinced Netanyahu by saying, "You can't fight the world." Mass actions still scare those in power. We have also seen many unions express solidarity with Palestine over the past 2 years, mainly through issuing solidarity statements, but we still have a lot of work to do to involve union members and workers in general to the same extent as 2003. The emergence of groups like Labor for Palestine is a positive development, as it connects labor unionists across sectors in their organizing. But the question does still remain of how to engage rank and file workers in all of our Palestine solidarity work. Although we currently have lower unionization rates than we did in 2003, the continued dependence of the economy on labor means that workers will always have an important role in mass movements. In Canada right now, we're seeing an initiative to declare Israeli products as hot cargo, not to be touched by workers of conscience. In Italy, millions of workers went on general strike in support of the Samud flotilla, which forced the conservative government to send over a protective vessel. But the strike is still ongoing and has actually grown in size, so the true impacts of it are yet to be seen. Looking at messaging, one of the earliest rallying cries was "ceasefire now." In the initial horror, it definitely made sense to call on Canada to demand an immediate ceasefire, not just to support one, but to actively fight for one. Like "Don't attack Iraq," this slogan was meant to organize the widest possible opposition to the war, but it was also important to think about raising other demands as the genocide accelerated. With the release of the exceptional document on Canada's arms exports that came out earlier this year, it was really good form to add the slogan "Arms Embargo Now." While the demands of BDS, boycott, divest, and sanction, were always present in the movement, further focus on those central demands and the tangible actions that our government could take is really important in messaging. Narrowing on the Canadian state combats the narrative of the genocide as, being a foreign conflict that we have no control over, a sentiment that prevented even people sympathetic to the cause from joining the movement. Also, messaging that addresses Canadian complicity is especially important when the anti-genocide movement has to combat the material and diplomatic aid that Canada is providing Israel, something that is less visible than directly being involved in a war, which can almost make it harder to fight. After all, while the Iraq anti-war movement had a tremendous win, it was still able to completely stop Canada from materially supporting the war. Just like with the Iraq War, many people have been introduced to organizing and broader political movements through Palestine solidarity. And we still have our work ahead of us. While a ceasefire has been called between Israel and Palestine, Israel is repeatedly violating it, and we're currently seeing increased military spending across the globe, including in Canada. It's important that we do not forget the lessons that we've learned from Iraq, from Palestine, and from any conflict before and in between, until the day when we no longer need an anti war movement.